So what are American Catholics to do? Well, in 1829, the Plenary Council of Baltimore was called, and it referred to the building of Catholic schools in this country as, quote, essential. Another session of a Council of Baltimore held in 1844 mandated that Catholic schools must be erected within 5 years of the establishment of a parish. And why not? Because they are, quote, essential after all. More universally speaking, Father Stravinskas referred to the 1917 Code of Canon Law, which said that Catholic students are not to attend a non-Catholic school. It was just viewed as incompatible with the ultimate goal of life, the common goal we all share, which is to grow in holiness, to become a saint. You cannot love what you do not know, and it's the job of the Catholic schools to teach us all about God, who we are to love and serve in this life in order to be happy with Him forever in the next. Pius XI, in conjunction with the 1917 Code of Canon Law, taught that so-called neutral schools are bound to eventually become hostile to religion. And as Father Stravinskas noted, if that of course is the obvious case today in so many school districts in our own country, especially in the tri-state area of New York, where we come from. And so he said we need to be more bold voices in saying the controversial truth that it is irresponsible for Catholic parents to send their children to government schools in our own day. But as we will get to a little later on in the review of Father's conference, the burden should not be shouldered by the parents of students alone, but is the responsibility of all the faithful to support the Catholic education of the future of the Church. The Second Vatican Council, in the document Gravissimum Educationis, says that even in this modern world of ours, which we are opening the doors and the windows up to, Catholic schools, quote, retain their immense importance. So they are not the relic of a bygone era, but they retain their immense importance, to quote Vatican II. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops taught in 1971, in a time where we really saw the beginning of the closure of so many Catholic schools in a rapid way, that they are, quote, the most effective means of educating the youth and spreading the faith. So even in the trying decade of the 1970s, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops gives their wholehearted endorsement to Catholic education. Pope Paul VI acknowledged that the strength of the Church in America is its schools. John Paul II, upon assuming the office of the papacy, stated that he wanted to give, quote, a new impulse to Catholic education in the U.S. Why? Because it's the best way to communicate Christ to our youth. Furthermore, the Church has recognized the importance and success of the Catholic school system in the United States because this is an immigrant country, and generations of Catholic immigrants rose from poverty to the highest sectors of society because of their Catholic education. And with such a success record, we cannot turn our backs upon it. Our schools, quote, nurture the soul of this nation. They do not just help the Catholic populace, but they help the whole country by providing good and productive citizens and even easing the burden off of the government school system. In the city of New York, if all the Catholic schools were to shutter tomorrow, the government could not provide the education for all of those youth. So the church and her schools provide a service to all of civil society. The 1983 Code of Canon Law, Father mentions a few particularly prescient points that, in light of what I just said, what Father elucidated for us, civil society must recognize the primary right of parents to educate their children as they wish. So as Catholics in America, we are facing an injustice where Catholic parents are penalized for choosing to educate their children in a parochial school. And we should be stronger advocates in the civil sphere for the right of parents, and civil societies should support, that freedom of choice for parents, and also, of course, acknowledge the good that Catholic schools do for the country as a whole. The 1983 Code of Canon Law especially gives a mandate that we must take seriously as priests, as pastors, as a bishop, and that is, quote, "Pastors of souls have the duty and obligation to provide a Catholic education to the faithful." The best way that comes, according to the mind of the Church, is through the institution of the school. So, in summary, recognizing this tremendous importance of Catholic schooling, according to the mind of the Church throughout all of these generations, it is the duty of the entire body of the Christian faithful to foster Catholic education. Again, it's not a burden that is to be shouldered by the parents of students alone, but it's a precept of the Church, right, to support the mission of the Church, to take up not just in the realm of tithing, but if you count 7 precepts of the Church, sometimes people count only 5, but I think there's a traditional 7 that says we're all to contribute to the missionary impulse of the Church. And that must be doing our part to support Catholic education, which is the greatest means of spreading the faith. Father was sure to emphasize to all of us with the responsibilities of a Catholic school to make sure that there is a moral clause in employment contracts, because of course we want teachers most especially to embody the mission of the institution, which has to have the Lord Christ at the center. Finally, the 1983 Code of Canon Law emphasizes that the Catholic school must be at least as good as the local government school. Catholic schools are not some niche Bible school, but rather they are meant to educate the whole person so that the student is a positive contribution to civil society, while also, and most importantly, becoming a better Catholic, a better disciple of Jesus Christ. All of this is to say that we cherish Catholic schools, and we must do our duty in continuing to foster their mission. Why? Because the fundamental duty we all share is to evangelize, to give the gift of salvation, to become saints. That's why Catholic schools are so important. That is why, according to the mind of the Church and her Magisterium, they must hold the pride of place in our efforts of evangelization. Thank you, Father, for such a wonderful conference. It's a good start. Thank you.
Good summary, yeah?
Hope I did you justice.
We'll find out. This last point that Father Sean was making, Bishop Kennedy, he was the director of evangelization for the Archdiocese of Boston, and he made a point of saying that the Catholic school must be considered in the vanguard of the new evangelization. He said the most effective tool we have in the new evangelization is precisely the Catholic school. And if he were here to entertain us with his lofty concepts and so forth, he would, I think, beat that drum very, very strongly. Okay. So, just a kind of quick review of the history of education, Catholic education in the U.S. And why? Because you have to know where you come from. If you don't know that, you don't know where you are or where you can or should be going. The sentence I'm going to read to you was the first sentence of my doctoral dissertation at Fordham, which was on the Supreme Court in Catholic schools, for which I got unbelievable opposition from the Fordham School of Education, all right? Because they considered it very inward-looking rather than outward-looking. Can you imagine, all right? And I said, well, if we don't look at the fact that we're in serious trouble, we ain't going to be here for any outward look, you know? It was just a terrible mess. But here's the first sentence. The first school within the territorial expanse of what is now the United States was a Catholic school established by the Franciscans in Florida in 1606. Actually, it was the first part of the sentence. Was now the United States. And my dissertation advisor, who was actually kind of a nice guy, he said, Father, that's kind of a stretch. Like, yeah, the first school was a Catholic school? And then I said, well, read the rest of the sentence, all right? The Franciscans in Florida in 1606. And again, we've got this Anglo approach to American history. So it's the 13 colonies. Well, there's more to the continent and to the country than that. And some years ago, I was doing a faculty workshop at St. Paul's School in Jacksonville, Florida. And it happened to be Catholic Schools Week. And the pastor asked if I would celebrate the Mass for the kids during the week. And so I was doing a little kind of a dialogue homily. And I said, can anyone here, I explained the importance of Catholic schools, blah, blah, blah. And I said, can anyone here tell me where the first Catholic school in the country was? Hands up all over the church. And I said, a little fourth grader, he said, here in St. Augustine Diocese, 1606 and 4. The kids knew that and were very proud about that, all right? Right? And and then the opening of schools in all the Spanish territories was a pattern followed in California and New Mexico as the Franciscans sought to educate the children of both the colonists and the Native Americans. And this is an important point to understand, huh? The missionaries were doing this on a two-track system, right? So the children of the colonists, yes, but also the indigenous population. So the Spanish exploration. Then the French led the opening of the first school for boys in New Orleans in 1722 by a Capuchin friar. And then the Ursuline nuns began a girls' school in that city 5 years later. Now notice this is, we're still pre-constitutional America, all right? And these schools became prototypes of schools to spring up along the St. Lawrence River, in St. Louis, Kaskaskia, Mackinac, Detroit, Vincennes, Maine, where a Catholic school existed as early as 1640 in Maine. Right? In the British colonies, Catholics experienced relative freedom only in Maryland, as long as the Catholics were in control, and also in Pennsylvania. And it was in places like that that Catholic education began the development into the system that it's today. The groundwork laid during the colonial period served as the foundation for the massive Catholic educational effort that would flourish within 50 years of the ratification of the Constitution. And then much of what parochial schools became, and still are, came through a series of events played out in New York City. The chief protagonist, or some would call him antagonist, was Archbishop John Hughes, whose nickname was Dagger John, because when it would print his name, the sign of the cross came out as the dagger symbol in printing, but the Protestants said it referred to his personality, and he was fiery. Right? But from 1840 to 1842, he was embroiled in a heated controversy over Catholic children and their education. His first complaint centered on the overt anti-Catholicism in the so-called public schools. And then when assurances were given that the most offensive aspects of the bigotry would be stopped, he next attacked Bible reading in the schools as a sectarian religious exercise, right? And unacceptable to the Catholic community. Interestingly, he was joined in that fight by Unitarians, Jews, and atheists. And so it's kind of difficult to figure, where he worked in all of this. And unwittingly, he may well have paved the way for the secular humanism that prevails in the government schools today. But his most notable achievement was gaining for the immigrants the right to operate and control their own schools. He was unsuccessful in getting government funding for the schools. And here's where the rub comes in. He was an Irish immigrant, but he knew American constitutional law upside down and backwards. And he applied, when he started St. Peter's School in Lower Manhattan, Mother Seton's Church of Conversion, when that school was opened, he applied for funding for that school. And he was denied the funding. And he said, well, why? Well, because yours is a sectarian school. And he said, the Episcopalians have a school, the Methodists have a school. And he said, and the Constitution, as I read it, and the correct reading, is the government cannot fund any single religious institution. It can fund them all, or it can fund none of them. And he said, so if you're funding the Episcopalians and the Methodists and the Lutherans, then you fund us. And they said, the old codger knows the law. And so they decided to declare all of those other schools common schools, and the Catholic school as the sectarian school, and so ineligible for any kind of government aid. And so that launched us on this trajectory of 200 years of paying twice, as my mother used to call it, double taxation. You pay for the school that you don't use, plus you pay for the school that you're going to use. I remember as a boy in Newark, my mother said to the pastor one day, and at the time, every second child in New Jersey was in a Catholic school. Not every second Catholic, every second child in the state was in a Catholic school. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of kids. And my mother said to the pastor one day, Monsignor, and again, as I said in the homily, she was feisty. And she said, I think what the bishops of the state ought to do is close all the Catholic schools for 2 weeks and put all those kids in the public school, and let's see if they would come up with some idea about funding. And the pastor looked at her and he said, oh, Mrs. Stravinskas, we wouldn't want the people to think we're bad citizens. Imagine. So again, if you think that you deserve nothing, well, you get nothing, right? That would be like a black in 1964 saying, Civil Rights Act, I'm black. My mother was a slave, her mother was a slave, I should be a slave, right? And so you're used to the second-class treatment, and you operate accordingly. Right? At any rate, unlike Hughes, though, Bishop Spalding of Peoria was adamantly opposed to any government money for the schools, precisely on the concern that there would be an infiltration into the school system. And while the first Catholic school, as I say, operated from 1606, it took more than 2 centuries, though, for those institutions to be organized into anything resembling a system. And it was the German-born Redemptorist, naturalized American citizen John Neumann, who accomplished that fact. And so as the 4th Bishop of Philadelphia, Neumann established a diocesan board of education, catch this, with clerical and lay representatives from every parish. And when Neumann took over the Diocese of Philadelphia, it was all of Pennsylvania, part of New York and part of New Jersey, right, which he visited on horseback. Right? No wonder he died at, what was it, 46 or 47, right? But when he took over the diocese, there were 2 Catholic schools, and at his death, there were 100 in a very, very short tenure, fewer than 10 years as the ordinary. So, yeah.
Yes, simply just to say that this Bishop Newman
Yeah.
was a student of the Piarists.
See, the flag is waving again. Yeah, of course, Neumann Newman, in Philly they call him Newman, which always causes problems with Cardinal Newman, and New York actually has it right. It's although I'm told that he Americanized his name and actually was being called Newman in his lifetime, but who knows? But what Neumann established, and again, notice that cooperation that he envisioned between the parents and the clergy. And so a board of education for a diocese in the 19th century. And he ends up being called the father of parochial schools in America. Also in Philly, by 1892, Archbishop Patrick John Ryan had appointed a Philadelphia priest to full-time work as a superintendent of schools. 1892. And the commitment to Catholic education continued to grow, especially under Cardinal Dennis Doherty, which established a unique system of free Catholic high schools. Doherty was a fascinating character, a guy of great insight. And in the post-World War II era, he would call a pastor up and say, what are you doing this afternoon, Father? And, well, nothing. Oh, nothing? Well, I mean nothing if you want me to do something. All right, well, we're going to come by and we're going to go for a ride in the country, which was Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Right? And they would go out for a half hour, a 40-minute ride, and he'd tap the chauffeur on the head and say, pull over. And they'd be out in the middle of a cornfield. And he'd say to the pastor, Father, the school, the convent, a few years later, the church, eventually the rectory. And the priest would say, but Bishop, Your Eminence, there's nobody here. No, but they will be here, and if you're here first, they'll come. He already saw the movement out of urban America into suburbia. Half the parishes in Bucks County were built with the parish being there first. He would buy 1,000 acres at $1 an acre, use what he wanted, and then sell off 900 acres, and the buildings were paid for before they were ever opened even. But tremendous insight and vision. Huh? I mean, that's one of the things we suffer from in the church today. Number one is a lack of vision. Well, first, a lack of faith. Right? When people tell me our problems in Catholic education in particular are financial, no, I'm sorry. That's not the problem, right? We have the most affluent Catholic population in the history of the church, and American Catholics now outstrip Jews in amount of annual income, right? And yet we can't. The institutions built by penniless immigrants can't be supported by the most affluent Catholic population in history. No. Problem ain't money. The problem ain't money, right? My Ukrainian grandmother, who raised 3 kids by herself during the Depression, made $5 a week and gave $1 a week to the church. And I remember saying to her as a little boy, Grandma, how could you do that? How could you afford to give $1? The priests say, must build the church, must build the school. If not us, who? A sense of ownership of the project. Huh? This was our responsibility. We had to do this. 20% of her income in the Depression, all right? Amazing. And what's the average Catholic give today? I think we're told something like 2%. My pastor in junior high used to say, Catholics are for the birds. Cheap, cheap, cheap. And they are, can't support the institutions. Not can't, won't. And then the strong beginnings in New York and Philly spread throughout the country so that American Catholics could boast of the largest privately sponsored school system in the world by the 1950s and the 1960s, and then the bottom fell out, all right? Through a whole series of self-inflicted wounds, frankly. So very quickly, just on that before we move to the identity, any historical observations?
Why is it the tendency of many Catholics to be so stingy in their giving?
Well, I think, first of all, because they've been raised to believe that the church is immensely rich, right? And secondly, that, you know, priests and nuns, of course, they don't distinguish between religious and secular clergy, that, you know, we all have this vow of poverty, and so everything's cheap. I mean, it's, you know, and so also, though, and we've been punished for this, we relied particularly on religious, specifically women religious, for very, very cheap labor. And then when the bottom fell out with, you know, they're all going over the cliff, and they had to be replaced by lay teachers, people weren't prepared to fork over the money at that point.
Okay.
I think it's just something it's also part of the immigrant mentality. I mean, you know, we can be on the third or fourth generation of immigrants, but still somehow or other it's this very, you know, insular approach to reality. And I mean, the salaries of American priests, for example, that's embarrassing when you look at it in terms of other denominations, or a newly ordained rabbi, a reform rabbi, who will do next to nothing. He'll have a youth group and maybe a Sabbath service. They start at $90,000 a year plus a house, right? And yet, you know, what's the average diocesan priest get in the country? About 25,000. There's something off, you know, with the whole thing. Okay, anything on the, yes, Father?
Father Peter, just what struck me about last presentation, this presentation, is the fact that, you know, while we are quite miffed and disturbed by the fact that the bishops have no unity, it seems as though it's historical.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, there's, you know, it's been there from the very beginning, and you know, part of the problem with the American hierarchy in the 19th century was all kinds of ethnic warfare. Yeah, the French bishops against the German bishops against the Irish, and all of that nonsense. You'd never think we all belonged to the same church and really had a common enemy to, you know, join forces about. So, and it's not correct to say that those problems weren't theological. A lot of them were very theological, right? And so the fact that, you know, you can point to X number of bishops today having bizarre positions, well, they're in the line of succession. You know? Anything else on? Yeah.
I was just going to comment. You're talking about the Archbishop of Philadelphia. I read somewhere that one of the early bishops in Florida, St. Augustine, Father Davis may know more, used to fly around the state in a plane.
Okay, so that's Archbishop Coleman Carroll, and he did something similar throughout all of everything from the middle of the state all the way south to Key West. So he was named the first bishop of Miami, and he would go up with civil engineers and civic officials in a helicopter, and he would say, I'll take 10 acres there, I'll take 20 acres here, I'll take 50 acres there.
Right.
And he was able, with forward thinking, to know exactly how population trends and demographic shifts would take place. And so it was about every 5 miles. And so if you go up University Drive, where my parish is at, it's every 5 miles, maybe 4 miles, that there's another Catholic parish. And there are other streets like that in Florida, where it's every so often there is another parish, precisely because of the vision of that ordinary, who was able to think about, was able to see, was able to imagine, was able to dream what would happen in the future as far as the population shift. And that's exactly what happened, and that's why South Florida has just an amazing number of Catholic parishes that are huge and right at the center of population centers.
And with a strong school system. Back to the question of faith. I remember one time Mother Angelica told me she was involved in a conversation with somebody at a convention who said to her, I'm surprised about, you know, a nun starting this, you know, international network and so forth. And he said, how did you do this? And she said, faith. And he said, well, I'm an atheist. And she said, that's why you don't have a network. But you look at, the American saints. Almost every one of the American saints had some role to play in the Catholic school system, right? And they didn't have feasibility studies. They didn't have, all of these commissions and building commissions and all the rest, right? They saw a need and they responded to it. Mother Cabrini, she died at the age of 67. She made 22 crossings of the Atlantic, and she was terrified of the ocean, right? 22 crossings, 67 years old she died. She had established 67 schools, hospitals, and orphanages, one for every year of her life, right? And you say, how is it that, what's the problem here? And now, I'm not a reckless administrator. I believe in, making sure that, everything is in place financially and so forth. But none of this ever would have happened if the same criteria of today were imposed on Mother Seton and John Neumann and Cabrini and all the rest of them, right? They saw a need, and like my grandmother said, if not us, who, right? And you do it, and you move on. But this brings us then to the present moment. And I always say there are I'm a great believer in niche marketing, right? And I would suggest that there are two niches that can be uniquely filled by a Catholic school today. The first is that it's authentically Catholic, right? And secondly, that it's academically rigorous. And we'll talk about the academic issue later in the week, but authentically Catholic. Going to the university level, I don't know if you saw this study a couple of years ago, I think maybe 2 months into the fall semester at Georgetown, someone went around and did a survey of the freshmen, and 82% of the freshmen expressed amazement when they were told that Georgetown is a Catholic university. Right? They'd been there for 2 months, right, and never knew what it was, right? And we laugh at that and say, well, what do you expect? But that also became a problem in a number of Catholic schools in the late 60s and early 70s at the elementary and secondary level. And so authentically Catholic. And what do we mean by that? When I do some of these Catholic school workshops I did for Father Davis and his previous parish, and he did it with 2 other parishes, and I have a section I call Breathing Catholic Air, right? And so what do we mean by that? That crazy Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart, when he was asked to define pornography, he said, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it, right? And it's the same thing you can say about Catholic identity, right? There are certain criteria. So, for example, Archbishop Miller, when he was working in the dicastery in Rome, came up with these benchmarks, as he called them, which are good. But it's not simply a matter of checking off items. So, there's a crucifix in a classroom, there's a statue of the Blessed Mother, you say a prayer at the beginning of the school day, you have a religion course. There's more to it than that, okay? It is a complete integration of the entire educational process with the Catholic faith. And I said to those teachers in Miami a couple of years ago, I said, let me give you some examples. I said, you're teaching social studies, 4th graders, and an ambulance goes by. And you stop and say, boys and girls, let's pray for the sick person, let's pray for the medical personnel. I said, or, you're teaching math, and the church bell tolls for a funeral. Let's stop, pray for repose of the deceased, consolation of the family. And a teacher in the front row started crying, and I thought, oh, geez, what did I say? And I said, is there something wrong? And she said, oh, no, Father, that's so beautiful. She wasn't doing it, not because she was opposed to it, hadn't been trained to do that kind of thing. When you had the sisters in the schools, there was, first of all, within the community of religious, an inbuilt formation process, not simply of a religious, but of a teacher. And so, the nuns would be in the common room at night knitting or something, and one would say, listen, I'm having a problem conveying a particular concept. And the other would say, oh, I had that when I had the 4th grade here. And it was all an internal process. And then very often in larger schools, you had 2 or 3 sections of a grade, and so a sister was there with 2 lay teachers, and she introduced them to the whole system. That's gone. So it has to be an intentional process now, which means ongoing formation of Catholic school teachers. When I give teacher workshops, what I say now in the 2000s, if I had said, I was saying it, in the 80s, in many places I was laughed at, but that generation is gone, okay? And either those schools themselves are gone, or certainly those teachers are gone. What we find with most Catholic school teachers today, the lay teachers, is a lot of goodwill, no hang-ups on ideology for the most part, but ignorance in the Latin sense of the word, just not knowing what can or should be done. And that's why it's so important, again, the role of the pastor for the ongoing formation of the faculty. So, for example, once a month at least, having a meeting with the faculty on some aspect of Catholic theology, or an upcoming liturgical season. Right? Speaking of liturgy, a Catholic school needs to be a liturgical community, right? Which means introducing kids to the seasons, the decorations in the building. So, we don't have Christmas decorations all from Halloween to the 4th Sunday in Advent, right? The first fight I always had in parishes that I took over was telling these parish groups, you can't have Christmas parties during Advent. Well, why? Well, because, see, it's called a Christmas party, and that's from December 25th to the Feast of the Lord's Baptism. So you don't have a Christmas party during Advent, but we've always had it, which of course is true. And you have to say no. Or some stupid schools will have a Christmas mass for the kids before they go home for Christmas. Yeah, that's not the way it works, right? So a liturgical approach to life, an introduction to the lives of the saints. So every morning on the PA system, the saint of the day. Kids are looking for heroes, and they're finding them in all the wrong places, all right? So whether it's sports or Hollywood or anything, they're all bad news. But we have some genuine models for them, and they appreciate that. And above all, it means that it must be presumed that every kid in a Catholic school goes to Sunday Mass. It's inconceivable to me that a kid can go to a Catholic school and not go to Mass on Sunday. Right? When I was a high school administrator, I required Sunday Mass attendance. And you say, how did you do that? Glad you asked. 2 things. Every kid had to come into homeroom on Monday morning with a signed bulletin from a priest who had celebrated the Mass that they attended. Now, my mother didn't raise a dumb son. I know anybody can get a bulletin signed by anybody. So phase 2 was religion class on Monday. They had to write a 2-paragraph essay on the homily they heard. Paragraph 1, here's what Father said. Paragraph 2, what I thought about it. All right? Now, I didn't get an iota of opposition from kids or parents. Well, what was a parent going to say? We don't go to church? Where did I get the opposition? Priests, pastors, who said, they all admitted that their teenage Mass attendance was up by about 80% probably, right? But one guy said, he said, have to sign those damn bulletins after Mass. I said, Father, I know. I celebrate Mass too. I know what a crucifixion it is. I mean, after a 40-minute Mass, I have to go to bed for the rest of the day. He said, you're being sarcastic. I said, no, I'm trying to show you how ridiculous you are, right? So you're signing, 5 bulletins after a Mass. Exhausting. Another one said, you're giving kids a bad taste for religion. Of course, that's the 60s argument, all right? Revisited in, 2000. And I said, well, let me explain something to you. I said, the head of our English department requires every kid once a year to go to a live Shakespeare play in Manhattan. And in New York, kids don't get driver's licenses until 18. They probably should be 30. So at the time, it meant the kid was going to take, a car service or whatever. The ticket, and this is 30 years ago, was $75 for the performance. They weren't going to have a Needix hot dog on the sidewalk. They were going to go get a meal somewhere. We're talking about a $200 expenditure for the day, all right? And the parents said, thank God she does that, because it's introducing our kids to culture. And we hope they're going to take that with them for the rest of their lives. And I said, and that's what we're trying to do here with Sunday Mass attendance. And I said, and besides, we're saving their souls from hell. And he said, oh, you believe that garbage? Okay. Yeah. Where's our problem? Okay. There it is. Lack of faith. All right. Now, what was interesting about the parents, I had two groups of parents that made comments, the positive ones. All right. The first group said, thank you, thank you, thank you. It eliminates a fight on Sunday morning. We just say, get in the van, let's go. The second group said, thank you. We fell away. No animosity toward the church. You don't go 1 week, you don't go a second week, you just don't go. And thanks for getting us back on track. The kids were fascinating. Now, I always walk through the cafeteria every day, but particularly on Fridays, you'd hear the kids say, hey, where are you going to church on Sunday? I'm going to St. Teresa's. What time? 5. Why? Well, down the block at 6:30, there's a movie that's playing. The kids planned their weekends, their Mass, with each other, all right? And they enjoyed it. There was no crisis in their lives, that something was being forced on them. They just, well, that's what Catholic kids do. They go to Mass on Sunday, all right? So, a liturgical community, a worshiping community. Now, in the Catholic Education Foundation that I had, we established a Catholic school identity assessment a number of years ago. And a number of dioceses, well, Indianapolis, we did a high school. Miami, we did a grade school. I'm trying to think, we didn't do anything in Denver yet. We did all of the schools of the Gaylord Diocese when Bishop Hebda was there. It's interesting also with Hebda, when he got there, of course, that's a very rural diocese, right? And he was being pressured by a number of people to close a number of the small rural schools, like 75 kids or something. And he said to me, well, I went to the archives and I looked up these schools, and well, that school, when it was established in 1910, had 6 students, and it now has 60. He said, you've grown 10 times over. So we did all of the schools of Gaylord. We did all of the high schools, diocesan and parochial, of LA with this assessment instrument. And it's a detailed process. It involves, well, it's 3 phases. The first phase is the most important. It's a self-study. So every member of the administration, faculty, and staff sit down together and fill out this assessment instrument. Probably takes, well, for the administrator, one that takes longer, but for the teacher thing, it's probably about 35, 40 minutes. And it's asking them to reflect on various aspects of the Catholic identity, or lack thereof, in the school. And it's interesting that, well, yes, we did it in Denver. I forgot that. The pastor had inherited a school that he said, most of the teachers are pretty good, but there are 2 of them that I think are loose cannons, and we probably need to get rid of them at the end of the year. And so he did the assessment process with them. We take all the data. It's done anonymously. The data is processed through SurveyMonkey. We do an analysis of the data and say, here's what you've said about yourselves, all right? And based on what you have said about yourselves, here are our recommendations, all right? And so this priest, they did the study, and it got to be about March, and they started thinking about renewal of teachers' contracts. And after a faculty meeting, the 2 teachers went up to him and said, well, by the way, Father, don't bother offering us a contract. Oh, why is that? And they said, that survey made us think that maybe the school's going in a direction we're not too comfortable with. Self-selection, out, right? I said, well, I hope you give the Catholic Education Foundation about $10,000 because we saved you a couple of lawsuits, right? But that's the kind of process that is. The second level is if a school wants to do an on-site visitation. And so I come out and spend 3, 4, 5 days, depending on the size of the school. And so I visit classrooms, I meet with administration, with alumni, and so forth, with student council. And then I say, okay, here we had phase 1 is what you said about yourselves. Now here's what I've observed, and here are some recommendations. And then if a school wants to go to a third level, then we offer a seminar for the faculty on what we call needy areas. So is it integration in the curriculum, or however, what's the particular problem? Is it a discipline issue, and so on? And we've done this in about, I guess, 35, 40 dioceses. Sometimes just one school in a diocese, sometimes an entire system. But people have found this extremely helpful. And so we have a section on the spiritual life of the school, which has, let's see, 38 questions. Right? Curriculum. So, for example, are textbooks in all disciplines selected with a view to ensuring they accurately reflect or at least don't contradict Catholic teachings? Right? This reminds me of a teacher I dealt with, was a biology teacher. She was on, the school, she was brand new to the faculty. 1 month into it, she comes to me, moaning and groaning, she doesn't like the biology textbook. I really care, I said, well, we're not changing the horse in midstream. I said, get comfortable, and, the important thing is not the book, it's the teacher. You can have a bad book, and if you're a good teacher, it can work, all right? I said, but if you're still committed to wanting to get a new textbook, and that's one of the another nice things about Catholic schools, you don't have bureaucracy of school boards and everything else. A teacher and a principal can sit down and say, we're going to change the textbook, all right? And you do it. I said, if you're still adamant about this, come talk to me in February or March, and we can talk about the possibility. So she comes, February 1st, there she is. We got to get a new biology textbook for next year. And science was never one of my strong points. The only C I ever got in life was in chemistry, and I still hold that against the nun. And so I said to her, come up with 3 textbooks, and then we can talk. So she brought in 3 textbooks, and the one area of biology that I did enjoy always was genetics. And so I take the textbooks home with me, and I open up textbook number 1, and I read the introduction to the book. We need to be grateful that we live in an age where religion does not stifle scientific inquiry. What? This is a textbook proposed for a Catholic high school. I said, okay, signal 1, bad. Then I go to the chapter on genetics. And it says, the father of modern genetics is Gregor Mendel. And it's got a picture of him from the chin up. So I called her in the next day and I said, looked at the textbook. I said, there's some real problems here, huh? She said, really, what? And I said, well, read that first paragraph in the introduction. Well, no one reads the introduction. I said, I read the introduction. Right? I said, I can imagine some parents may pick up the book and say, why are we paying $12,000 a year to have our kids told that the church is the enemy of science? Right? Sister Elizabeth will go through a whole thing for us this week on that. Right? I said, now let's go to the genetics chapter. I said, read that. She said, no, he's the father of genetics. She said, well, that's correct. I said, but it's interesting, they've eliminated an important aspect of the man's identity. Oh, what's that? And I said, he was an Augustinian. Oh, really? Oh, that's nice. And I said, she said, so you don't want that textbook? I said, no. And actually, I don't want you next year either.
That's right.
I mean, if that's what you know and don't know, I don't need you in the situation. At one of those high schools in Gaylord, I walked into a biology class, and of course, teachers are always nervous. I always say teachers and priests are very similar. They hate to be evaluated, all right? And so I walked into the classroom, the teacher froze. And I said, oh, go. And she said, she was giving a handout. And she said, oh, here. And again, she didn't know I was coming. And what is she giving the kids? She said, we just finished the unit on genetics. And I'm giving the students, we're going to analyze today, Cardinal Ratzinger's document, Donum Vitae. Yes. Yeah, that's where it should be done, all right? I used to say to my religion teachers, I don't want to spend you to spend an inordinate amount of time in religion class on abortion. No? I said, no, that's in biology class, right? You finish the units on fetology, all right, or genetics, and you say, the Catholic Church takes science so seriously, that she says because that's a human being, that's why it needs to be protected. So everything, again, this permeation of the curriculum. A section on extracurricular activities. For example, we don't schedule games on Sunday mornings. Right? Or discipline policies. Right? There's a Catholic approach to discipline. Right? It's fair. It's consistent. It doesn't matter whether your father is the state senator or the local janitor. Right? It's the same application across the board. The relationship between the school and the greater school community. And and then we have at each section quotes from various popes about that particular aspect of Catholic identity. So it's a very, very cheap process. It's about $1,500 per school. And I've said to pastors and principals, if that breaks the budget, all you need to do is ask the local Council of Knights of Columbus. I bet you they'd write the check tomorrow for it. And so someone said, I think you make it too cheap, and it sounds cheap, and therefore people aren't interested. Well, I hope people aren't that superficial. But it's a way, and one priest had said to me that he was convinced that he had a very, very strong, authentically Catholic school. And he said, I don't really think there's a need to do it. He went through the process and said, there are a lot of things I wasn't even thinking of that are in there. So I would recommend it. I think it's a help. It's a help to you and to the principal to work together to go toward these goals of authentic Catholic identity. All right. So questions, comments. This is a very subservient group. Yeah, fine.
Well, what would you do when you found a kid wasn't going to Sunday Mass regularly?
I told them, like any ball game, 3 strikes and you're out. I said, 3 times miss Mass in a semester, you're out of the school. That's all.
What age group was that?
High school. With little ones, it's sad because, how many of us heard confessions of little kids say, I didn't go to Mass because my mommy won't take me. But with the little ones, when I tell them at confession, I said, why do you go? My mommy won't take me. I said, okay, let me ask you this. If you wanted to go to the mall on Saturday afternoon, your mother said no, what would you do? I'd ask her again. I said, okay, and if she said no, I'd ask her again. I said, well, here's your penance. And if your mother asks you while you're doing it, you tell her, because the priest told you this, right, that from Saturday afternoon at 4 o'clock until Sunday afternoon at 8 p.m., you stop your feet and scream until she finally says, get in the car and go to church. And it is a sad confession to hear, The poor kids, they can't do anything about it, And they know there's something wrong. Right? And once again, it's a disconnect between we're telling them what the 3rd commandment of God is, and yet their parents aren't living this. Right? Well, as I said, at Vespers this afternoon, I got my parents. Well, I forgot to mention something about my father's comment when my mother said to him, the nun's telling him we're going to go to hell. And he said, well, what did you expect her to say? And I think that needs to be clear with parents. I always made a point that we didn't register children, we registered families, right? And a kind of covenant or a relationship between the school and the family. We commit ourselves to providing the environment in which the school's education is going to further the faith life of our family, right? And so when you get the problem then if something's not going right, you say, You signed this. Did you not mean what you wrote, what you signed on to? And people say, well, then empty the school. I don't think so. I don't think so, right? And as I say, my experience was most people who are not going to Mass are not hostile, right? It's just a bad habit sets in. And we've all heard confessions of someone who's been 40 years away from the sacraments. And how did this start? I missed one Sunday and I missed another. Then you feel weird about going back and all the rest of it, right? So, anybody else?
You mentioned something about curriculum review when you took the book and you looked at it and thought it was inappropriate. You know, there's different levels of curriculum review. So, you know, there's the teacher, there's the department chair, there's the academic dean, the vice principal, the principal, and then of course there might be the pastor is involved in this to that extent that he can be. And also one wonders, you know, just how much micromanaging has to be done. It's always the balancing act of you want to know what's happening in the school, whole and entire. You want to be sure the Catholic ethos is put in place. You have to presume if you're hiring professionals and they know what they're doing, that they're actually going to be making good decisions at their level of authority. You know, we do believe in, allowing church to take place at the lowest level and most effectively at that level. One day I was in the high school administration and I came across a book that was on the summer reading list for our students. It was a paperback book, a couple hundred pages. It was fiction, and it was entitled "How the Garcia Girls Lost Their
Virginity."
No, it didn't say virginity.
Oh.
It is with ...
Oh.
at the end of it. That was the title of the book.
Mm.
And a parent brought it to my attention. Father, this looks kind of strange for us to be having our children read this in a Catholic school. Can you review this and just kind of take a look into the situation? And I did. And I was scandalized to find out that book was part of our curriculum. Now, I was the supervising principal president of the school. I'm not into the micromanaging of something that's happening in the individual classroom per se, but it ended up that when I became aware of something, I had to quickly launch down into that level and said, what is this all about? Well, I found out that it was a decision that was made within the department, and there were a couple non-practicing Catholics that were part of it, and a couple people that were more secularist in their outlook of things. And they chose that thinking it would be a tantalizing read and a good read, and kids would be able to write a composition about that afterwards. And so I had to confront the academic dean. I had to confront the principal. We had to call in the department chair. Ultimately, we got rid of that book immediately, and we had to issue a disclaimer and an apology to the parents and to the students for having that kind of filth in our curriculum.
Sure.
But I wouldn't have presumed that would have been part of my specific role in terms of chaplaincy, in terms of supervisory administration, to have to be at that micromanagement level right there in the classroom on something as simple as an assigned book. And yet, part of our role as pastors and as administrators is that we indeed need to be aware of what's going on, and we have to set the bar so high that no one would ever dare, break faith with what we're about in terms of the kind of curriculum we assign. So anyway, that led us to do a total curriculum review of every category and every department to make sure that there was nothing irregular or aberrant that would go against the faith. And it just goes to show that we can't be blind to think that everything is going to be happening well at different levels. We have to take a sense of responsibility to be able to take a look into these matters. And it's about assuring the Catholic identity and fostering the mission, and it's about making sure that things are not going to be inappropriate and even scandalous to the faith. It does fall to us. We can't abdicate that responsibility.
Well, pastors seem to be in two extremes, micromanagement or non-management. And I was a weekend assistant for a priest who was very involved with the school in a good way, but turned into a micromanager. Picture this. He insisted on reviewing the menu for the cafeteria, right? And again, in the Northeast, most of us have busing by the public school district. He was involved with the bus routes. He had an extremely competent sister for a principal with 4 other nuns in the school and the whole business. He's involved in minutiae. And finally, the nuns just said, you know, you really don't need a principal here. and we don't want to be here if you're the principal. And so off they went. But it's those 2 extremes that, you know, in medium stat virtus, you know. So, Bishop, you have some...
I'm conscious of the time, so maybe I would just add a few things to what you said rather than summary. I think a crucial part that it's all right here to, is, from my own experience, is stress for identity is the hiring. And so the president. So when you come to a school, as I said, when I was assigned to teach at Marin Catholic, another priest went in the year before. Now these are unionized high schools in the Archdiocese of San Francisco, which complicates that. There were two city schools, a suburban school. Actually, there was a merger, so 5 to 4. But we had an ex-nun reading tarot cards in religion class, and this is the early 90s. And so, and then there was the AIDS education program. This is the 90s that came from the Oakland diocese, which took it from the public schools, and it was the bananas and the condoms and things like that. So this was kind of this, and the practicing Catholic families were they went to the pastors. Fortunately, the pastors were of a generation of men several of them had been themselves teachers in Catholic high schools in the 50s, and so they were trained for that. They were very good pastors. So we had tremendous support of the pastors about that. But when it came actually to you just couldn't take anything for granted. So you had kind of the challenge is who is actually the administrator, that is the president, the principal, and then those overseeing curriculum. Of course, you can't tackle everything at the same time, but those are all crucial. The athletic director, how do you treat sports? How's you're dropping the F-bomb all the time when the coach is tolerated. But it took a great effort because who actually is the one making the decision on who is hiring? So that has to be very clear. And then you have with the teachers. So you don't get surprised like this situation with the book. I had to meet with, and now the latest thing we're dealing with in Catholic schools, how are we dealing with the race issue? So is it a program that is really being brought from the public schools? So I had a meeting with the president and the principal, and I said, I'm going to give you some advice because people are calling in and what is being deemed, they're using a video of microaggression and all that. And I said, I'll give you advice on how to best handle this. If what you're doing is found in the public schools, you're making a mistake. You root this program in 2 things, Jesus Christ and the truth. And I said, then you will not upset anybody because you will know what is true on the race issue and what is false, what is manipulation by the press, and what is plain to basically a largely white community. And I said, you have to root in Jesus Christ, nothing else, not the latest survey and psychology and everything else. So I would say that Catholic identity can go in the tank if you don't have a leader of the school who actually believes and practices, and then in turn hires people. Now I found that some of the best teachers were not Catholic but respected the church. The worst was some of the ones who went to school there. Well, Father let us do this. Well, the place was kind of a dumping ground at one time for problem priests, and then you had some crazy religious. So I think when you look at the history of why the schools were founded, as far as whether it was St. Augustine, Florida, or it was, we can thank much of the whole Catholic school system historically with the Germans, who so bristled around the Protestant in Wisconsin who wanted some type of Catholic because of the hostility, the know-nothings, of course, and all that. So I think we went from, as Mary Pat said, we've been in the Church of Christendom, which is, the United States, and as I said, you draw a line from Baltimore to St. Louis to San Francisco. Those were all Catholic cities without baggage that New York or Boston or Philly or other parts of the country have put up with. But as that area becomes more and more secular and now hostile, the very reasons we founded these schools are the very reasons we must strengthen them, because the community is becoming increasingly, again, whether it's hostile or indifferent, is the challenge. So historically, the need is still as strong. The identity is even clear because you have a generation, like with Mass, I think if we polled the people, I mean, this was the big debate of the bishops on the Eucharist. We have even the bishops who say, well, why this? We have to stop this. Well, I think it scandalizes the laity that we are even debating the importance of the Eucharist. Now, some will say various things, but that's fundamentally what it comes down to. But when it comes to Mass, I mean, we have to make sure our teachers and our principals go to Mass. And on the other hand, they shouldn't go to Mass and realize that, like the joke was, Father died about 20 years ago, but no one told him yet. I mean, he was just I mean, the Mass, I don't think he knew that Jesus rose. And so I think, on the other hand, then we have the game show host priest. Is it your birthday? And that type of stuff is insanity. So I think what we're striving for is when it comes to the Mass, the leadership has to really believe in the strength of the Eucharist. And that will strengthen the identity. And I'm going to give 3 things that I think I learned from a couple of the Daughters of Charity, which was built with the De La Salle Christian Brothers, and even with the Sulpicians. I went to the Jesuit University, USF, but I don't think Spanish spirituality has a room for develop as the French school humility. But I've been telling the young priests and seminarians, and I think it's for our Catholic schools, if you're humble, you know all that we have, we've received. I think of all the many benefits we've had in Catholic education. If I learned one thing from the Daughters and the Brothers, is that we didn't do everything for you. Your parents did it, and we shared in part of it. Now, there's a certain other religious order. All success comes from them. You were privileged to be in this elite society that markets a country club with initials. That's not the Brothers or the Daughters, and I think diocesan priesthood should be. And our schools, humble. When we're humble, we're grateful. And it's only then we can be generous. I think we have to be really generous in this community because we are building up, we are becoming our identity has to be strong so we can go out. Not like shotgun blast Catholicism, where I have to tell some of the young guys, no, that's not going to work. Berating the people from the pulpit. On the other hand, can we all just get along? Ministry is not going to be effective either. So I think our identity is strengthened, and I think the bishop sets the tone, the pastor sets the tone. But when you, again, the micromanager, I had to suddenly move a guy to another parish. I said, because he was micromanaging things. On the other one, I had a guy who, good young priest, enthusiastic, but never been to a Catholic school. So he surrounded himself with his adoring fans in the homeschooling community. Well, they never come to you complaining about a fight because a kid didn't make a team and why we have to have the PTG fundraiser. The father's always the hero in that circle. That's not reality. And so I think you have to have, for the Catholic identity, the pastor is not, he is the spiritual father who sets the tone. He's also the spiritual leader, but the principal is the educational leader, assisted in the spiritual leader's role. There's only one educational leader, and there's only one, unless it's a priest or both, and one spiritual father. But together they work. And then we have that identity, then we are who we say we are. I think one of the greatest challenges, and I'm going to see this when I take over the Committee of Catholic Education, we've emerged now with schools that have suffered in the mission. You have sometimes these they get up there and they read from the founder of the order. But the founder quoted Jesus. So somehow we made the founder the new savior. And that's not what we're about. Because, and I would tell the parents, Marinka was in the middle of a middle class community. And I said, our job is to get your kid into heaven. But we better get them into a great college before that. And I think that's really the purpose. You can do both. And I think this became this kind of
Either or.
either or. So that's kind of my thoughts on what you said.
Just about the teachers going to Mass. It's fascinating to hear kids say, oh, I saw Mrs. Smith at the 10 o'clock Mass on Sunday. The other thing that I always recommend, both for grade school and high school, is that Friday religion class be a sneak preview of the Sunday readings. Right? So you're preparing the minds and the hearts of the kids. This is something you're going to do. And then Monday religion class, tell me the most interesting thing you heard at Mass on Sunday. And so there's kind of a peer pressure at that point I had a wonderful Holy Cross sister that I taught with who said, in Catholic education, you got to make the good thing the popular thing. She said, there's always going to be peer pressure. It's usually in the wrong direction. Use it for the good. Right? So, yeah, Father.
Bishop, I just want to respond to two things. First is, first of all, me real fast. Thank you very much for your acknowledgement of Daughters of Charity. They're wonderful women, and I know that they were in San Francisco for many years. I think some still are there.
Yeah.
But one of the things that you said that was so on point was this piece about, after Ex Cordea Ecclesiae, all these religious orders refounded their universities, their colleges, in the image of their religious founders. But again, they lost the fundamental, foundational step that Jesus Christ was the impetus for the foundation of their congregation. And that, I believe, is going to be a significant problem as we move to the future, as we think about these religious orders and their role in these universities and colleges.
I was going to say, and that's my words to Catholic Charities. I said the why behind what we do is more important than what we do. We do this in response to the gospel. And I've often kind of run a lot about Vincent de Paul. They accuse me of trying to destroy 150 years of Ignatian spirituality in the Northwest. But I said, with Vincent de Paul, why did he do it? Because of Jesus. And we have to, I think, the why, and that allows us to move forward in hope. Because a lot of times I think the church wants people, they want to be optimistic, which is wishful thinking. It's like the kid who got kicked out of Marin Catholic for stealing a master key, then came to me 2 years later and wanted me to write a letter of recommendation for Georgetown. And I said, you got kicked out. He said, let's call it an involuntary transfer. I think it's a government job now, but I said, that kind of optimism, wishful thinking, no, hope, reality grounded in faith. The reality is these are challenging times. But our faith says, I'm with you to the end of the age. And I think that drives us to move forward amidst these struggles we're in.
And I'm not convinced that the religious orders founders are going to sustain the university or the college and people paying $25,000 to $45,000 a year so that they can have a Jesuit of Ascension or Franciscan education. My second question is more probing, and I'm curious to hear your reaction to this. Often enough, we're spoken about as Catholics as being the last punching bag out there. And I live in New York. The Jews, they get anything they want. They're right up front. They're very much out there. So if they have a problem, they go right to City Hall, and they're very forthright about their yeshivas and their reform schools. And we see that quietly emerging in Europe with regards to the Muslim schools.
Yes.
How do we move beyond being a humiliated group to a true sense of humility?
Humility, and the words that when I was appointed to Spokane, Bishop Bigelow met with me a few months later, says, don't let kindness and humility be mistaken for weakness. And I think that, humility is again, knowing what your strengths are and what your weakness, but you put it in the ground. We're given a mission. And I think everybody in this room is priests. We're to persevere in the mission of saving the souls of our young people. Giving them the truths of Jesus, persevering in giving the truths of Jesus, as Jesus persevered in redeeming our souls to the point of giving his life. And I think for us, we became, and New York would be the same thing as probably Philadelphia and San Francisco, and we had arrived. So I don't think it was like, it was like we knew we were strong, and so we could take the hits. It's just like, but I think we don't realize how, in certain cities, hostile things are. Downright, actually hostile. I think the most privileged person, at least in the quote from, is probably a biracial transgender city worker in San Francisco. That's the most privileged person. And I think that's where we're going. So I don't think we have Dagger John Hughes versus John Ireland's approach. Still, now it's being played in the new same script, just new characters. And I think we just have to be very clear about what we're doing and not allow ourselves to be pushed back, because we are providing in all things, whether it's like one last, I know at the time, the opening up of the churches because of the pandemic. We had a plan because of Eastern Washington is more farming and agriculture. We didn't have the problems of Seattle. Yakima, because the packing houses in between, they were closing. But our people going into northern Idaho to Coeur d'Alene, or to Montana for Mass. So I met with our health officer. First of all, he comes in, he says to the seminary, by the way, fill those holy water fonts. I'm not Catholic, but I know holy water is important. You can't get it from holy water. And so he came in, he's, give me a plan. If it doesn't, the governor didn't address it, you give me a plan and I'll look at it and see. So we moved forward on it. I sent it over to Seattle. I get a call. The governor's not happy with your plan. I said, well, how did the governor get my plan? And I said, we're moving forward. Now they wanted us, the governor's assistant wanted the bishops of the state of Washington to write a thank you note to him so he could be ready at the press conference. And I said, I'm not writing a thank you note. My people think I sold them out for crumbs when they first began to open up. I said, we're not doing this. So eventually we pushed and we had greater freedom. But I think that wasn't my style. Let me take care of my flock. I don't want to be the big civic leader. But I thought this, for the sake of our people, I had to do that. So,
see, I think the other part is there's a congenital inferiority complex in Catholicism in this country. We're still, even though some of us are sixth and seventh and eighth generation, still afraid, number one. And number two, a false humility. We don't like to toot our own horn, right? And one of the good things with the pandemic was other people ended up tooting our horn for us. They're saying, how come, if you watch Fox every morning, every single day they were saying, the Catholic schools in New York are open, the Catholic schools in Philadelphia are open. They were doing it for us. Why were we afraid to do that ourselves, right? There was a superintendent of schools in an unnamed diocese that they announced the test scores for the state, and which were rather abysmal. And I called the Catholic superintendent and I said, how were the Catholic school scores? He said, very good, above average and everything. I said, well, are you going to announce that? Oh, no, we don't want to make the public school people feel bad. I said, are you for real? I said, can you imagine if the shoe were on the other foot, right? They'd say, why are you paying money to go to those miserable Catholic schools where the kids don't learn anything? He said, and he said, and Father, I hope you're not going to write an article about this, which I did. But again, we've met the enemy, and it's us. We're causing the problems for ourselves, and the lack of leadership, right? It's so intertwined. And the Catholic school exists within the church, and so if you have leadership problems from bishops and pastors, well, the school can't be much different. It's the same environment. It's toxic in so many places, right? Yeah.
And this is just a comment, but rather than this being disheartening, it is hopeful that people are recognizing this and getting back to the why of why we exist. It's allowing us to further clarify that mission.
Oh yeah. Well, again, when you're clear, I was talking to the bishop about another prelate the other night, and I said, this man, he's orthodox, he's intelligent, but he's conflict avoidance. And as a result, he's involved in more conflicts than he would be if he were more aggressive in things. In all my years of school administration, I think I probably expelled maybe 5 or 6 kids because they would say, you know what he'll do, all right? And so you never have to do it, right? And so, again, that's part of leadership. And this consummate desire of priests to be loved. And again, I learned this from an old nun when I started teaching. I was a sophomore in college seminary, and I was teaching kids at the high school that I went to. And when I was 18, I looked like I was 12. And the only difference between me and the kids is I was in the cassock. But I had no classroom control whatsoever, so I would scream and shout, say, sit down, shut up, blah, blah, blah. And one day, the nun called me aside. She said, honey, I think you have the makings of a really good teacher. I said, well, I think the kids hate me. She said, they do. She said, but not to worry. She said, earn their respect, the love comes later. And we've got that all backwards in the past 40 years. Everybody wants to be loved, and then when you have to do something nasty, then they say, what happened? I had a teacher who had absolutely no control in the classroom whatsoever. And I knew, I inherited him, and I knew he wasn't going to be back the next year, but there he was. And one day a kid comes to my office, and I said, what do you want? And he said, Mr. So-and-so sent me to you. I said, well, for what? Well, I don't know. And I said, well, you know, we have a policy here. You get a detention for an infraction, but if you say you don't know, you get a second one for being stupid, right? So what is it? And he said, well, he threw me out. He said, but Father, he said, you know, he just went ballistic. And this kid had been misbehaving all semester, and then the teacher just said, out, out. And the kid said, who's spitting your cornflakes this morning? And so he comes down to me. And so I go to the teacher later in the day, and I said, Mike, he said, that kid, he's been trouble from the beginning. And I said, yeah, but you didn't deal with it. I said, the first time that he misbehaved, she was like, right, cool it, end it. I said, but instead this went on interminably. And then he justifiably asked you, who's spitting your cornflakes today? What got you so upset that this was now the boiling point? He said, you're taking his side, not mine. Well, that's not the point of it, right? And again, we talk about consistent discipline, right? And discipline is a part of human nature. No parameters. Well, go look at the public schools. I've been doing for about 5 years student-teacher evaluations for Grand Canyon University, which brings me into all kinds of public schools and suburbia, inner city. I remember the first time going in one school and someone said, hey, what happened? And somebody said, what? And he said, there's a priest here. And so, somebody died, obviously, but you go into, and these are jungles and suburbia, 14 kids in a fourth grade class with 4 adults and still chaos, right? Kids getting up and walking out, and you say, where are they going? Oh, I'm going to the bathroom. This one guy, I said, go to the bathroom. I said, if they weren't hydrating all day long, they wouldn't have to go to the bathroom, I said, but let me tell you, I said, when I was in 3rd grade, we had 82 kids in the class, all right, with 1 nun, and a kid would raise his hand and say, Star, what do you want? Star, can I go to bathroom? She'd say, number 1 or number 2? We were a family, and the kids say, number 1, cross your legs. We have recess in 20 minutes. Today she'd be in jail, But all she was asking for was some self-control, right? Now, whatever you feel, you do. So, a kid gets up and screams at a teacher and curses and all the rest. And you say, what do you expect? But again, it's all part of the identity of the institution.
I think the failure of parenthood is really impinging on what we can do in our schools.
In my school evaluations, one of the first recommendations I always make is the school has to have sessions for ongoing parent formation, at least 4 times a year. And this is not the report card business. This is parenting skills. Because you have a generation of parents now who were not properly parented themselves, so they have no idea what the heck to do. And again, sometimes there's resistance to it. It's like with the pre-Cana stuff, where they say, oh, who wants to go to that? And they're there for the second session. They say, it's actually pretty good, right? But no, you can't ignore that element of the equation, because that's a big part of the problem.